Welcome. Willkommen, willkommen, liebe Freunde und Freundinnen des Kreisky-Forums. Welcome, dear friends of the Kreisky-Forum. Can you hear me in the back here? Because perfecto. So, we are here actually when we planned our lecture, our talk series called Courage, how Russian human rights activists are fighting for several things, under, for example, the end of the war in the Ukraine, democracy in Russia, and also for the rights of the prisoners imprisoned in Russian penal colonies. We were very happy that Yevgenia Kara-Murza agreed to come to Vienna. But we did not know under what circumstances this meeting here today would be held. And so since Friday, we have all been under the shock of the sudden death of Alexei Navalny. And so I would like everyone to get up and have a moment for Alexei. Thank you very much. I think it's very, very difficult to have any conversation at the moment without being trying to overcome also the shock of this event, of this tragedy and of this crime. And I'm very sorry, Yevgenia, that we are sitting here today under these circumstances. And our original title, How to Fight Putin, suddenly becomes even more urgent than ever, because at the moment we have a situation where the Russian authorities even refuse to give his body to the family, and his mother has to stand outside of the prison in Siberia calling on Putin or on whoever is responsible there to at least release the body. So your situation, Yevgenia, to tell you a little bit more about our guest, is in a tragic way almost as dangerous at the moment, because we have Yevgenia, who is Russian, lives in America for almost 20 years now, has not asked for becoming a Russian human rights activist in her original training. She's a translator, and from French and English to Russian, she translates. She is a simultaneous translator. She is a mother of 3 children, and she is a wife of a Russian politician and activist and journalist called Vladimir Kara-Murza. And they have been living in the shadow of Putin's reign for now almost 25 years. First in Russia, then in America. And while your husband was a TV correspondent in Washington for a private Russian television network, NTVI, there was also a lot of political debate going on, a lot of political work going on, because I think he was one of the first ones who understood also that this new Russian president that took hold of the power in Russia was not planning to be the first real democratic president of the 21st century in the Russian Federation. And so your husband sort of worked with all the options that liberal politicians in Russia had at the time, with liberal opposition figures. First he ran also himself for parliament, then he worked with Boris Nemtsov, who for a while was the hope for alternative to first Boris Yeltsin, but then also to Putin. He worked with Open Russia, which is the foundation that Mikhail Khodorkovsky founded, which hopes to strengthen democratic structures in Russia and the civil society. And then your husband started to get involved in something which took a long time in Europe, especially, to take hold. The idea to have a sanctions regime for personalized sanctions that can be put on criminals in Russia who commit crimes for which they will never be persecuted. And this original idea came after the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a lawyer who was killed in prison, and that was in 2008. And since then, your husband has working with a whole group of activists to get this legislation implemented in America, in Canada, in the European states. And ironically, it was implemented only after Alexei Navalny was poisoned in 2020, and the European Union, the Council, agreed to implement this Magnitsky list, which is now called the Global Sanctions Regime for Human Rights in the European Union. So, to put the long story short, we have as a guest today a wife of an activist, and the reason why Evgenia had to step into the limelight is that her husband sits in prison too. He is in a prison in Russia and has shockingly been sentenced to 25 years in prison for criticizing the war in the Ukraine. So, Evgenia, first of all, since Friday, it is of course the very shocking moment when we have to realize that your husband is in high danger on his life. Did you hear from him? Did you have a possibility to get a message through?
Thank you for your kind introduction. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope to be able to provide a small glimpse, maybe, into what is happening in Russia tonight. I have not spoken to Vladimir in almost a year, but I did receive a note from him through the prison correspondence system, prison mail system, and also his lawyer went to see him yesterday, and he found Vladimir absolutely enraged in his cell because of the murder of Alexei Navalny. Yet another one of our colleagues, yet another one formidable, intelligent, brave, pro-democracy politician was gunned down by the Putin regime. This is not the first time in our life that this happens. In 2015, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated under the Kremlin walls. This was someone very close to Vladimir, to my husband, and he took it deeply personally, and I don't believe that he ever came to terms with that assassination, and now yet another one. Boris Nemtsov was my husband's mentor, and then he became his close friend, and then became our daughter's godfather. So in February 2015, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, and 2 months after that, my husband Vladimir collapsed in Moscow with very weird symptoms. 2 days after that, he was in a coma with a multiple organ failure. hooked to every possible machine because none of his vital organs worked. He stayed in intensive care unit for 3 weeks in a coma. There were no guarantees that he would ever wake up. And there were no guarantees that if we did wake up, he would wake up still being Vladimir. And I remember talking to his medical team. I remember I told his doctor, his main doctor, do anything you have to do. I need my husband to wake up as my husband. Legs, arms, I'll take care of it. I don't care, I'll take care of it. He will be walking, running, driving, playing guitar. I need the amazing brain of my husband. That's Renaissance man whom I married 20 years ago, a journalist, a historian, a filmmaker, and a politician. He was also a musician at some point in his life. He played clarinet and played it quite professionally. And then came the time in his teens when he had to choose. Guess what he chose? He was choosing between music and politics. Since then, he has not touched his clarinet. The clarinet is still there at home in its wonderful small box. So I've been living for 20 years with someone who refuses to accept the future that Vladimir Putin planned for our country. I've been living with someone, been sharing my life and raising kids with someone who believes that our country deserves better. And he does not believe that because he is somehow misinformed about the Russian population. He does not believe it because he is just some unkillable optimist. No, he believes it because he saw these people, he knows these people, he worked with them. When he worked for the Open Russia Foundation of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, he traveled across the entire country, building a network of activists, journalists, young politicians around the country. And whenever he would come back home to me and the kids, he would talk about these amazing people he met there and there and there again. And he would tell me about how enthusiastic they are, how knowledgeable, what kind of informed questions they asked, how much they knew about their regions, how much they knew about the local structures that they wanted to develop. He saw the hope in these people. And this is the reason why my husband continued his work and his fight and continues even from behind bars. This is why he believes that a different future for Russia is possible, despite it all, because the reason we see Russia in today's state is because the regime has done everything to destroy the social institutes, to destroy horizontal connections in society, to disinform society to a very deep level. The Russian population, the majority of the Russian population that still relies on TV as the main source of information, sad truth, but yes, has not had access to one single independent TV channel since 2003. That's 20 years of hearing the same message repeated again and again and again from all channels. Russia is this great country trying to get up from its knees while everyone out there wants to see Russia's demise. But Vladimir Putin did not jump out of the box. He has been on the scene for almost a quarter of a century. To some, it was obvious where he came from and what he would do to the country. Because well, I always remember that story that Vladimir always goes to, and he's a historian, so he analyzes, you know, he has this amazing understanding of events, and he sees parallels that people today very often disregard or do not notice. Parallels, you know, and I mean globally, the democracy is sleeping. We see a lot of problems. We see a rising number of political prisoners and hostages all around the world. We see that democratic institutes are not equipped to deal with the global crisis, human rights crisis. We see that democracies are not very well equipped to face those despotic regimes that are growing stronger around the world. Now, but talking about Vladimir Putin specifically, my husband often goes back to one specific incident that took place in 1999 when Vladimir Putin was still prime minister. So in that year, he put up a memorial plaque to Andropov on the KGB building in downtown Moscow. Andropov was someone who introduced punitive psychiatry in the Soviet Union. And it is to this person that Vladimir Putin decided to put up a memorial plaque in downtown Moscow on the KGB building. That was KGB building because Andropov was head of KGB at a certain period. And, well, you know, I remember Vladimir thought about it and said, well, that's it. That's all clear, who this person is and where he would be taking the country. Today, punitive psychiatry is yet again used as one of the means of repression against dissenters in our country. So we came the full circle.
It's quite interesting. We always say, like, okay, so we have now, as you say, psychiatry is used as in Stalin's time, again, for locking away people and declaring them insane. But also the general prison system is now becoming stricter and stricter. The prison sentences are longer and longer. Your husband was shockingly sentenced to 25 years in prison, which is also a higher number of years than the usual sentence at the moment for people who criticize the war. In any case, it's sort of wrong, but I was always wondering where you see the differences also with the Stalinist regime, because we so lightly now make this, not lightly, sadly, but we make this comparison, and I'm thinking we have a very strong authoritarian character of the Putinist reign, but we don't have necessarily a totalitarian system. I mean, where are the differences to Stalinism, and what's the difference also in the world, on the world stage?
Well, there are certain elements of the Stalin era present today, and Vladimir Putin, who is very proud of his heritage, of course, in his mind, because he's a former KGB operative, the only thing that he can build is a gulag. So he goes back to those very, tried methods and that were successful back then. Why not? I mean, punitive psychiatry was quite effective. Punitive psychiatry was actually introduced later, but say prison terms of 10, 15, 25 years, this is an element of the Stalin era. And the narrative that the regime is using today is also very, it reminds me a lot of those times, because if you reread Solzhenitsyn, that's the same narrative used by the state. There are no dissenters in the country. There's just an incredible number of criminals, spies, and traitors. And this is the way these people are portrayed. My husband's case, yes, so far he's received the longest prison sentence at one go. Alexei Navalny had had years added to his sentence again and again and again. My husband was just tried and sentenced to 25 years, to a quarter of a century. And the accusations against him are very illustrative of the way dissenters are treated in Russia today. So the first accusation was that of spreading knowingly false information about the war. And that accusation, that law on spreading false information was introduced 9 days after the full-scale invasion had broken out. Because the regime realized that there would be people talking against the war. There would be people trying to voice their opposition, so a specific law was adopted to target these people. And that law, under that law, a person can go to prison for 10 to 15 years. So that was the first accusation. The second was the association with a so-called undesirable organization. Anything that has to do with human rights in Russia today is undesirable. The Sakharov Center and Memorial were both declared foreign agents and undesirables. The organization I work with, the Free Russia Foundation, a civil society organization that brings together different civil society, anti-war and pro-democracy initiatives and supports these initiatives both in Russia and outside of Russia. We create platforms for Russian-speaking communities around the world, trying to rebuild the society those horizontal links between people that the regime is doing everything to destroy. So that was the second accusation. Again, as I said, everything that has to do with human rights is being labeled as undesirable or foreign agents. Activists, politicians, journalists specifically are all foreign agents. And there is this very sad joke. Sometimes if someone has not yet been designated as a foreign agent, would look at a person and think, what's wrong with you? Yes, so
all these are sort of things that remind us of the Soviet Union and the enemy of the people, the enemy of the state. All this these are the narratives that are coming back to haunt Russia, but also all of us in a sense. But I wonder about the differences in order to find out how we can actually break the system is a big word, but to influence, to try to get a change done. And I wonder if there's something to the fact that there is actually no underlying ideology, because that's a big difference, isn't it?
Yes, you're right. And they're trying to somehow catch up with that as well, because history books in schools are yet again being rewritten. And certain periods in history are yet again being distorted to fit this very crude ideology that they're trying to come up with. Because yes, Stalin, the Soviet Union was built on ideology. This regime began as a kleptocratic one. It was all about stealing and stealing and stealing and hiding the stolen loot in Western banking systems. And then using the privileges that are guaranteed by free societies, by free democratic countries, while repressing the rights of their own citizens back at home. So it began as a kleptocratic one, and it's true, there was no ideology. I think that they're trying to think of something, and the books that are being rewritten, they point at the fact that Vladimir Putin is actually getting ready for a long war. And that is important to understand, because these books are being rewritten not just to misinform kids, but to raise them into soldiers. To make out of them those good Russian citizens who understand what Russia is all about. This empire that is led by its strong leader. Yes, there were, in totalitarian societies, first there is this ideology, and then there is a war. In Vladimir Putin's case, yes, he just messed it all up. But he's trying to catch up now. And the way it is being done and the speed at which it is being done is truly, well, it is frightening to me, even after everything I've seen. But I think it's maybe frightening because, yeah, we don't know where we'll end up. But the thing is, you said that it would be good to know what the differences are so we could somehow influence it, change it, stop it. There is no silver bullet here. And so there is no one solution, one single solution that will somehow change the course of Russia's history.
No, but for example, if you look at the war, and of course a lot of people, and we hear that also from street interviews of Russians, also in the last days again, where people say we have to finish the war because we are being attacked by the West and these kind of things. So a certain element of this ideology to think that, you have to defend Russia because there's a evil Western world out there that wants to capture the nation. But I suspect that it is not as strong as Putin would wish it to be, because on the other hand, you have now seen at the run-up to the elections in the middle of March that there was a sudden hype around a somewhat independent candidate, Boris Nadezhdin, who suddenly, because he was slightly critical of the war in the Ukraine, became quite popular. So a lot of people seem to understand that this war is not good for Russia.
You are absolutely right in suggesting that there is a part of Russian society that is deeply brainwashed. And unfortunately, with no social institutes, with no freedoms left, no free elections, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly or association, without any democratic instruments that are available in free societies to assess the actual opinions of the people, how can we measure how big that part of the Russian population is? Because yes, of course, what you see in those opinion polls, imagine that. Those opinion polls are conducted in a near-totalitarian state, where the regime uses very harsh reprisals against anyone who says, no, I'm not okay with this. In any way possible, people can end up in prison for standing in the street with a blank sheet of paper. There were arrests for holding a peaceful protest with a copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. In 2022 alone, at least 565 minors were arrested, and against 9 of them, criminal proceedings were initiated before the age of 18. Nikita Uvarov went to prison for 5 years. He was 16 at the time of his sentencing, for planning to blow up an FSB building in the computer game Minecraft. A 72-year-old woman went to prison for 5 years for making posts about the war. So in this society, imagine being approached by someone in the street with a camera and they say, what do you think about the war? Well, tell me honestly, what would you say if you knew what might happen to you in case you told the truth? And it's, to me, it's very, I hear sometimes answers in these street polls when people are asked the question and they would answer, I don't want to go to prison. What do you think they actually think, these people who say that? In a near-totalitarian state, trusting opinion polls conducted in a neo-totalitarian state is a very wrong thing to do. And we should judge about the state of that population, the state of mind of people in that population, by some secondary signs. And like the fact that Russia placed second worldwide in 2022 by the number of VPN services installed. Or the fact that even despite these very harsh reprisals, thousands of people went out to lay flowers over the last 3 days to commemorate slain Alexei Navalny. Or the fact, like you mentioned, this short-lived campaign of Boris Nadezhdin. We saw thousands of people standing in lines in low, cold winter temperatures for hours to sign petitions for Nadezhdin. He was the only candidate running on an anti-war platform, a very cautious one, still calling the war the special military operation, but still the only candidate demanding the end of the war and calling it a crime, which is important. And so these people were there, and they didn't know who Nadezhdin was. The majority of these people were young people. And Nadezhdin is from a different generation. They haven't heard of him. They don't know who he is. They don't care. What they care is that he's anti-war. And those who knew Nadezhdin in those lines, they knew that he was quite a questionable character, to tell the truth. There are many questions that can be asked about Nadezhdin, but again, he was the only one running on an anti-war platform. And like my husband commented during a court hearing on the video, he said these people were there not to sign petitions for Nadezhdin, but to sign petitions against the war. And when they left the signatures, you need to understand that it's not just signing a piece of paper. It's leaving all your personal information, your address, your full name, and you're being filmed while you're standing in that line. And later, Vladimir Solovyov, this odious Putin propagandist, also already commented that we now know the names and the faces of all the traitors. Traitors, he called these people in lines. So these are secondary signs that show that the support that Vladimir Putin claims he has, that's got nothing to do with reality. Because the difference here is not in, I would say that it's not even the quality of people who are in the street, the quantity of people who are in the streets, but the quality of that protest, because these people do this knowing quite well that they can be thrown in jail for many years, that they can be deprived of parental rights, and that scares me the most, as a mom of 3, that they can be tortured and killed. We began this evening by commemorating Alexei. Well, in 2023 alone, last year alone, according to human rights organizations, at least 50 people died during arrests or in pretrial detention across the country. At least 50. And the causes of death of the majority of these people are very questionable. That's just the circumstances of their deaths are very questionable.
But I wonder if we know now, and that was, we don't know exactly how and why Navalny had to die now at this moment, but the time just before the elections gives us a hint that maybe it was supposed to be shown clearly that everyone who raises their head or says something against Putin loses his life. So I imagine that it's even much more difficult now to think about strategies, also how to deal with the elections. So the last idea that Navalny floated was to go at noon during the election when the stations are open, and to show up just by numbers of force and say like, okay, we're coming to the elections, but just at a certain point when everyone knows this is the opposition showing up, and also crossing out all the names on the ballot paper and writing down Navalny there. Is this something that you think makes sense?
Well, I know that how important it is for people that are not alone, to know that they're not alone in this. My husband wrote to me that over the past few weeks he'd been receiving letters talking about that short-lived campaign of Nadezhdin. And they were not talking about Nadezhdin himself. They were saying how exhilarated they were to see these lines in the streets and to realize that they were not alone in thinking the way they thought. Because the regime is doing everything to isolate people, to make them feel like they're some weirdos and they are in the minority, that no one else thinks this way. And so that collective act allowed them to show solidarity with each other. So this is why it was incredibly important to people in Russia to be able to do this. And talking about the election, Alexei, yes, he did call, I don't remember who this initiative was launched by, but Alexei definitely supported it, Noon against Putin. And I know that all the pro-democracy forces I can think of are supporting the idea of going there at noon to show up in big numbers and also to see each other. Again, like in the lines, putting their signatures for Nadezhdin. But also now, after the murder of Alexei, I am calling on everyone, and my husband supports this, and other pro-democracy and anti-war Russian forces are calling for the same. We are calling on Russian citizens to not just go there at noon and cross all the candidates out, but to write Navalny across the ballot. I know that my husband did that in previous elections, only he wrote Boris Nemtsov. That was a president, the best president Russia never had, like my husband says. So yes, I believe that this will be an important way for all of us to see how many of us are there and to show to the world that there are many Russians who think differently and who do not accept the future drawn by Vladimir Putin for our country.
But of course he will still be crowning himself as the Tsar of Russia with any neglect of real numbers on whatever will end up on the ballot papers, his name or Navalny's name. We won't see the real numbers of anything. So wouldn't it make sense to just simply also boycott these elections and say this is just an illegitimate president reappointing himself?
This is an illegitimate president reappointing himself, you're absolutely right. And in my talks with politicians, I point to the fact that Vladimir Putin has no legitimacy here and should be treated and called out for who he is, a criminal wanted by the ICC, by the International Criminal Court, not a legitimate leader of the Russian Federation. And there are very specific legal grounds for that. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution following the so-called referendum in Russia in 2020 that basically destroyed the country's constitution, allowing Vladimir Putin to crown himself a Tsar forever. Because if you look at the amendments made to the constitution, you will realize that there is not one single thing that Vladimir Putin cannot do. He has absolute power in the country. He destroyed the country's fundamental law and acquired absolute power through doing this. The second reason, and so the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe revised these results of the so-called referendum and concluded that the referendum cannot be seen as legitimate, and hence Vladimir Putin cannot be called a legitimate president following the so-called election. So they called on all member states to declare Vladimir Putin illegitimate. Another very important ground for doing this is the fact that the election will be carried out on occupied Ukrainian territories, where people will be forced to vote. And they will be forced to vote in the right way, you know, in exchange for medication, in exchange for humanitarian aid. How can a process like that be seen as a legitimate democratic process by the democratic world? Not to mention the fact that Vladimir Putin either forced out of the country or physically eliminated all really strong contenders, competitors to his rule. He murdered Boris Nemtsov, he murdered Alexei Navalny, he forced many politicians out of the country. So I believe that declaring Vladimir Putin as illegitimate will be a very important signal, both to the Kremlin, a very important message, both to the Kremlin and to that part of Russian civil society that is trying to do everything to somehow bring closer the day when all this ends. And you see, this, and this could actually have another practical effect as well, because many countries, despite sanctions, despite pressure from the international community, continue doing business with Vladimir Putin, helping him avoid sanctions, offering him these corridors, you know, just back corridors. So maybe if he were declared illegitimate, if he were declared basically a pariah, maybe such countries as India or China that does not support Vladimir Putin openly, maybe they will think twice about continuing doing business with him. I don't know, but I think this, if there is a chance that this could happen, this chance should be used. The worst thing is not to do anything.
But under this level of the in principle condemnation of Putin and his regime, there are many other options, and we have tested a lot of them now. And your husband was, and I've respected him for many years for doing this endless, never tiring of trying to lobby for these sanctions regimes in an environment, especially in Europe, where people for a long, long time did not want to hear anything about, you know, being too clear to Putin that his way of being non-democratic was not acceptable for the democratic Europe. But so Vladimir was working for the Magnitsky sanctions, the personalized sanctions that can be put on people who commit crimes. We do have this now, and the EU is ready to put sanctions, more and more sanctions on people who do new crimes in order to freeze their money, let them not come to Europe, let their family members not go to schools in England, or have their villas in the south of France, all these kind of things that the Russian elite enjoyed. The question is, do you think that, for example, now the death of Navalny will lead to putting personalized sanctions on his murderers, everyone who was involved in killing him in the prison colony, but also in the judicial system that brought his sentences about?
I believe that the Magnitsky Law is a revolutionary piece of legislation because it sends a clear signal that when evil is being perpetrated, it is being perpetrated by specific people. And these specific people will not be able to avoid responsibility. And I believe that this is the revolutionary nature of the Magnitsky legislation, going after specific human rights violators and sanctioning them, telling them that they're seen as criminals, telling them that there will be not welcome in the civilized democratic world, that they would not be able to store their stolen loot elsewhere, and that the stolen, ill-gotten money is not welcome in the democratic world. I believe this is truly revolutionary, and I think that today, considering the nature of Putin's regime and what they're doing, the sanctions should, of course, touch members of the families as well, because what these officials and oligarchs are doing, they're just transferring all their stolen wealth to their wives and their children. And this is a way for them to avoid those sanctions. So their families continue spending that ill-gotten money stolen from the Russian population over 25 years, over 2 decades. And, you know, I'm sometimes asked, like, talking about sanctions against those responsible for Alexei's death. And I always say that, yes, these sanctions should be introduced against these prosecutors, judges, whatever, guards who mistreated him for 3 years after throwing him unlawfully in prison under trumped-up charges, and who either just killed him with yet another Novichok, and there are questions about that. I mean, his body is not being released to his family. His body will be undergoing some kind of chemical analysis, according to the Russian authorities, for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, they say that Alexei died either from sudden death syndrome, that is a very rare condition that is, you know, very specific to newborns, or a blood clot. But according to Alexei's doctors, he was not suffering from any condition that would make a blood clot likely. And also, if it were a blood clot, why not release the body to the family and tell them that go ahead, do your expertise, do your independent expertise. And then they would do this, and they would find the blood clot, and the Russian authorities would be able to say, you see, we told you we had nothing to do with it. But no, they will keep the body, not release it to his grieving mother, to his grieving family for 2 weeks, conducting some kind of chemical analysis. So yes, I believe that sanctions should be introduced against all of those perpetrators. When I'm asked, like, why would some judge or prosecutor in Russia be interested? I mean, they're not that wealthy to have money somewhere hidden in Western banking accounts. They don't go vacationing to the Côte d'Azur. They don't own vineyards. And I say, well, you'd be surprised. For example, in my husband's case, and this also proves how much the regime hates my husband personally, as its personal enemy, because Vladimir has been doing this kind of job since the death of Sergei Magnitsky in 2009 in a Moscow prison, where he was tortured, murdered. And for years he refused to be intimidated, and he continued his work. And despite all the poisonings, he still kept on going. And so in his case, there were 3 people on the Magnitsky list. The judge, head of the pretrial detention center where he was being held, and the head of the Russian investigative committee, Bastrykin, who personally supervised the case, although according to my husband's lawyers, the investigative committee does not deal with cases of high treason.
But so just so that everyone understands, you're saying that some of the people who were involved in sentencing your husband in 2023 had already worked, were the same people who were already working on the when Sergei Magnitsky was put into prison, and were involved in his killing indirectly at least, by being the head of the prison where they were held. And so we see that over these 15 years now, since Sergei Magnitsky was arrested, the same people are sort of the backbone of this Putinist regime. And we can sentence them, and we can sort of...
Absolutely, and they were put on the Magnitsky list. These three people I mentioned ended up on the Magnitsky list for their implication in the killing of Sergei Magnitsky, not for persecuting my husband. But they were judging the person who had worked to have the Magnitsky sanctions adopted for over 10 years. And so one of them, Judge Podoprigorov, who was the judge who sent Sergei Magnitsky back in 2008 to unlawful detention, and that's the reason he ended up on that list. And that's talking about, you'd be surprised. So I think it was the Insider who found out that this judge, a few years ago, used the services, employed the services of a very expensive British-Australian law firm to have the sanctions lifted against him in the UK. So when they say that the sanctions don't touch them, and when they look like they don't own yachts or vineyards in France, don't take it for granted, they do not. If they can afford employing a very expensive British-Australian law firm to have sanctions lifted, they do have something that they hold very dear somewhere out there, stashed somewhere in a Western bank.
But so if we think of what Europe can do now in order to maybe try to influence some of the things that happen in Russia. So we have these options with the sanctions, but it seems to me that probably the biggest way of influencing Russia is by supporting the Ukraine in its defense against the Russian invasion. And there I wonder if you think that what is now being discussed in Europe and worldwide actually is if these frozen assets of the Russian state in Europe should be used, or if the profits of the frozen assets in Europe should be used for supporting the Ukraine financially.
Well, first of all, I believe, President Zelensky spoke at the Munich Security Forum just a few days ago, and he said something, and one sentence stuck with me. He said, "Don't ask Ukraine when the war will end. Ask yourself why Putin is still able to continue it." Ukraine has been receiving enough help to maintain the status quo, to make sure that Putin is not, that the Russian army is not able to get further deeper into the country. They've been able to defend those positions, so to maintain the status quo. What Ukraine needs is to win. And so, yes, not just money, but money at the right time. Not just military equipment, but again, military equipment at the right time when it is needed and where it is needed. And unity would be good in this as well. The US Congress is still unsure about its willingness to sign the bill. And that is a very dangerous sign. Well, I think that these, I understand the tiredness of populations in democratic countries. I understand that some people are starting to say, well, how long can this go on, and how long can we be supporting Ukraine when now gas prices are rising, when this is rising, that is rising. Well, there are these frozen assets, and this could relieve some of that pressure, seizing these profits, whatever, and giving them to Ukraine so that it can continue and hopefully win this war. And that would also allow the relief of that pressure that certain populations feel and politicians feel and use that tiredness of their populations. So I would also, I always try to talk about the moral side, the right thing to do. But it's not enough in the world.
I mean, we're sitting here in Vienna, and of course the Austrian government has not always been on the side of the sanctions regimes within Europe, especially when we had a coalition with the far right, when the FPÖ was in government. Recently, it seems that the current government is looking at using some of the profits of the money, or maybe even all the state funds that are being frozen, Russian state funds, for financial aid for the Ukraine. So I think there's a little bit of a shift in positioning, even here, the longer the war continues. And so I wonder if maybe we could count on Europe, especially as long as in Germany also there is a government that has moved a lot over the past 2 years since the war began. So it's exactly now 2 years since the Zeitenwende. And although there's a lot of criticism towards the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but it seems to me that also the influence of the Green Party there was quite strong in changing the attitudes towards moving to a support of the Ukraine. And the German government is now, after the US, bilaterally speaking, the strongest, the biggest supporter of the Ukrainian government. So I wonder if you have the, I mean, in a very sad sense, the hope that the murder of Alexei Navalny also now shocks the world into continuing to support the Ukraine.
Well, that's my hope. But I will believe it when I see it. Because I've seen so much appeasement over the years. I've seen so many compromises offered to a clear dictator who was gaining more and more power and becoming more and more brazen in his aggression outside, in his in the use of repression inside. You see, I already said sometime during this discussion that Vladimir Putin has been on the scene for 25 years. And Anna Politkovskaya, whose picture I saw downstairs, was the victim of a political assassination that happened back in 2006. And Novaya Gazeta, for which she worked, lost 6 employees to political assassinations over the years. In 2008, there was the invasion of Georgia. There was the bombings of Syria. There was the annexation of Crimea. The people were beaten into streets, in the streets, beaten into pulp in the streets of Moscow in 2012 during protests, and many of them ended up behind bars with lengthy, at the time, lengthy prison sentences. Little did we know that the president, back then 3 years seemed like, oh my God, what is happening? Today, a person gets 10 and think, well, that's not bad. 25 would be worse. And, you know, I remember the world expressing concern. That's our favorite thing, concern. And then the deal for the construction of Nord Stream was signed. And imagine what kind of message is sent both to the Kremlin and to those people who went in the streets and protested and ended up beaten up and in jails. Well, Putin realized that he was basically untouchable. He could get away with all of this. And these people realized that, yep, we are on our own. No one out there really cares. And even though I was just meeting OEC ambassadors here in Vienna, under the legal documents signed by members of the OSCE stipulate that human rights violations do not constitute an internal affair of any state. And it is a thing that should be addressed by other members of the international organization. And such human rights violations should not only be prevented when possible, but also punished when they happen. How was Putin punished? With the deal for the construction of Nord Stream? So that has been going on for years. So in his warped mind, I mean, if he can invade Georgia and annex Crimea, why can't he annex the rest of Ukraine? Well, if he can beat people up in the streets and commit war crimes in Chechnya, why can't he do the same in Ukraine? It makes sense in this warped mind of a Tsar who's rebuilding Soviet Union and adopting the tactics Soviet Union used with regards to its citizens and with regards to its neighbors. It all makes sense.
Unfortunately, he's also very successful in getting rid of his opponents by imprisoning them, exiling them, or even killing them. As we know and as we have seen this weekend, there's one effect which is quite interesting. When Yulia Navalnaya yesterday in her video message said she will continue the fight of her husband and she will not give up and Russia will be free. It reminded me, we had 3 weeks ago here a talk of Sabine Fischer, who wrote a book about the threat of chauvinism coming from this Putinist regime. And it's true that there is almost only male influence on Russian politics. Even a lot of the opposition politicians have been in the 20 years men. Good men, if you want. You know, they were fighting for democracy. But now it seems there's suddenly an era where at least the Russian opposition gets a more and more female face. So, are you ready to take this on?
Not forget the Belarusian, also women.
And it's exactly the Belarusian too.
Yes, Svetlana and Yulia actually met recently in Munich and talked. I met Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, when was it? Oh my God, time flies. A year ago, after my husband's imprisonment. We also, like, her husband is in prison, my husband is in prison. Well, you know, you said that today's Russian political scene is men only, or mainly, let's say, and the women who are there are so odious in who they are. I mean, it's so sad. But it's also yet another thing that reminds me of the Soviet times, because not only are they men, but they're very old men, like the old Politburo, you know, just these graying, decrepit people. So yeah, I would love for that to change. I would love to see a change. And talking about new faces in Russian democratic forces, pro-democracy, anti-war forces, I participated in the Brussels Dialogue, which is a platform organized by the European Parliament with the help of four standing rapporteurs on Russia. And that is a platform of dialogue with these forces, because they want to see us, we want to show and tell them who we are, so that they would see this alternative to Vladimir Putin. This is, you know, I'm always asked about what's the alternative. Prigozhin, Patrushev? I mean, it's like, well, if Russian civil society, if Vladimir Putin is allowed to destroy, completely to annihilate Russian civil society, yes. Prigozhin is no more, but Patrushev is still there. And they can always dig up someone else. So we want to see, we want to show a different alternative, a democratic alternative, a peaceful alternative, also a very diverse alternative. An alternative of a society, you know, a society that will represent different ideas, different forces, different initiatives. And I remember that Brussels dialogue that was held over 2 days, and there were girls from the feminist movement, there were LGBT representatives, there were journalists, politicians, artists, you name it. And I was given the privilege of addressing the audience with this finishing speech. And I was just sitting there on stage and looking at this amazing room full of young faces, so different, so diverse. All the ethnicities, or not all of the ethnicities, there are over 190 different ethnicities and peoples living on that huge territory. But I mean, representatives of ethnic movements were there. There were a lot of young people, a lot of women, strong, resilient, opinionated in a very good way. And I was looking at that, and it was at the European Parliament, and I said, oh my God, this is what a parliament should look like. This is what we want to see in Russia. This is what we want.
Well, Russia will be free and diverse in its politics sooner or later. We certainly hope that the face of the Russian opposition looks like you. I would like to open now the hall for a few questions, because Yevgenia has been giving interviews and has talked political talk for 48 hours constantly. So, but if there are questions in the hall, I think we should take a few. Please tell us also who you are. We take the first 2 questions here, both of them green.